Yeah, my name is Jacqueline, master student at UBC. I've been at UBC for 2.5, almost 3 years now. I had a baby this past April, so I've been a little slower on finishing things up, but I'm most of the way done now. And I've put together this presentation called Digging Deeper, Conserving Beach Spawning Forage Fish in the Salish Sea. And it's a result mostly of my first chapter, which was all about coming up with a habitat suitability model for sand lance. And that's what you're seeing in this image here. Anywhere where it's dark purple is good habitat for sand lance, and anywhere where it's lighter purple isn't great habitat. And generally what we concluded from that work is that there's not a lot of suitable habitat for this understudied but critical species to the ecosystem. And this is work that I did under Tara Martin, who's my main supervisor, and she's my conservation guru. But I also work closely with Cliff Robinson, who's at DFO, and my funders are World Wildlife Fund. And I primarily have worked with Jacqueline Huard, who is really lovely, and it's been great to work with them. And of course, this is a major collaboration with a lot of people. I did a lot of learning, and you'll see all the conservation groups at the end that I am really grateful to have gotten to work with and use their data. So let's keep going. So this work is focused only in the Salish Sea, which I've pictured here. And this area is home to the traditional unceded territories of well over 100 different indigenous groups and peoples, such as the Wasanic, the Comox, or the Musqueam. And today I'm joining you from my spare bedroom in Stamanis First Nations territory. And like many habitats in this area, some of the sand lance intertidal habitats owe their utter existence to the traditions and protections of Indigenous peoples. These habitats, they're just one part of a larger ecosystem that we all depend on, and they're a vital part of this ecosystem a vital part of this ecosystem are the small forage fish that feed everything else, like seabirds, whales, and people. And so forage fish, they act as bridges in the marine ecosystem, connecting the tiny energy-rich plankton that's on the bottom of this schematic with the large predators that we care the most about, the ones that are driving our economies and our cultures, like salmon, or the ones that we just can't help but love to bits, like orcas. And so one of the forage species that I study in particular is Pacific sand lance, but much of what I study, and particularly the habitat stuff, is similar to surf smelt. I'm not really going to talk about surf smelt, but a lot of what I've done is relevant to them. So sand lance, Ammodytes personatus, they're a pretty interesting fish. They're small, they're skinny, they're found at northern latitudes throughout the world. They're generally, at least in this area, understudied. And interestingly, Amos is Greek for sand, and Dites is Greek for diving or immersion, and they do just that. The fish has been found up to 6 years old, but most of them die by 3 because they're just so delicious and everything wants to eat them. They're born as eggs in the sand, and a few months or a month later, they're free-floating larvae, and not long after that, they become full-fledged swimming adults. And so I'm going to walk you through some biology of sand lance, and overall, I think they're pretty interesting. As I said, they're small and they hang out in schools. They're from northern latitudes, and the first, particularly eclectic thing about them is that they don't have a swim bladder. And not having a swim bladder is also part of then why they burrow into sand. And they're photosensitive, meaning that they're sensitive to light, and they're able to read light levels, and they're active during the day or when there's a lot of light, particularly in the summer, and less active at night or when there's less light around in the winter. Also, a little bit weird about them is that they hibernate or estivate throughout the fall and winter, and really just unusual. So here's a cool photo that I'm showing you that is a cranial and axial skeleton CT scan that a researcher did, which I think is pretty cool to see. And they describe sand lance as having poorly adapted morphological features for burrowing. So although they have this elongated body, small cross section, fins that lie flat, Otherwise, they have very little in common with other species that live in sand. They, for example, have these large eyes that can take in light. Many of the species that live in the sand don't have that. They also have a complex skull that you can see in this CT scan with lots of soft tissue, but they have this really hard jaw. And they, despite apparently not being all that well suited morphologically, they burrow a lot. In fact, they're probably more in the sand than they are in the water. So all winter long, they're buried, all nighttime long in the summers. And if there's lots of predators or not a lot of food around, they're going to bury. They primarily eat zooplankton, mostly of the crustacea group, and their favorite thing to eat is pseudocanalus, but really they're going to just eat whatever is abundant and that they can fit in their mouths. So one thing that we have found a lot is that they're eating a lot of microplastics. We don't know if this is a major problem for them or not, but we do find that microplastics are concentrated in their habitat in the sandy sediments that we have been collecting. And it sort of threw us for a loop at first, like, how is all this microplastics getting concentrated down here? And we realized it was because they were eating it and then pooping it out, and then it would just stay there. And after a while, it builds up. So another interesting aspect of sand lance is that they regrow their gonads every year. So every winter they wake up in the middle of their hibernation and have freshly regrown their gonads, similar to birds. And they reabsorb them every spring once they're done spawning. And what cues them to spawn is still not clear. At first, there was some thought that maybe it was full moon, and that seems to be more tied to surf smelt, but it doesn't seem to be that tied to sand lance, and it just seems to be sometime in the winter, generally around the same time for different areas. A spawn event all seems to happen. And they are well known to spawn in the intertidal in this area, but we also think that they spawn in the subtidal. And so when they spawn in the intertidal zone, it's usually close to the high tide line. But in the North Sea, where there are also many species of Ammodytes, and they're better studied there because they're also commercially harvested. It's actually one of the more lucrative fisheries in the North Sea. They don't think that they spawn in the intertidal zone in that area. They just assume that they spawn in the subtidal, and no one's ever looked in the intertidal. But here in the 70s, if you've ever heard of Dan Pintilla, he's sort of the grandfather of forage species, or beach spawning forage species. And he and some other folks up in Alaska found sand lance spawning in the intertidal zone. And then since then, particularly in Washington, there's been a lot of effort put into looking at sand lance spawning in the intertidal zone. But more recently, we now have some evidence that sand lance are also spawning in the subtidal zone. Cliff and I did some work 2 years ago when we found 16 eggs just off of Sydney Spit. So that's really close to where the ferry comes in to Victoria. So we're pretty sure they also spawn in the subtidal, but we don't have a lot of evidence of that yet. So depending on the length, a female will deposit between 1,400 eggs and up to 16,000 eggs. So it can be quite a lot for such a small fish. And these eggs are going to be sticky, so they're going to grab onto the sand. They're about 1 millimeter in length, so pretty small. You can see them with the naked eye, but when they're in the sand, it's pretty hard to do so, particularly because they're so clear. And each egg has at least one fat droplet in it. Sometimes they have two, and this is what the embryo is going to survive off of. It takes them about a month to get to hatching, depends on the temperature and the year. And yeah, they spawn in the winter. Most spawning happens in November and December, but it can happen as late as March. In Alaska, it's earlier, it's more like September, October. But we haven't really found that transition yet. There doesn't seem to be a lot of people looking sort of north of the Salish Sea. They also have really strong site fidelity, which just means that they hang out in the same place often. And so I'm just going to walk you through quickly a cool piece of research that helped us figure this out. So here's a photo of an otolith, which is an ear bone in a fish. And this is coming from a sand lance of the lesser sand eel, Ammodytes tobianus, and it was from the English Channel in France. And many otoliths were collected in this study, but I'm just showing you one. And these researchers looked at 13 trace elements, and then they were able to sort of come up with a life history story that told them where the fish was from. And like tree rings, you can use fish ear bones to figure out how old they are and where they've been. And so I'll walk you through this a little bit. So here is that otolith in the center when this fish was really young and it was first laying down the rings where they're really tight and dark. That's when this fish was a larvae. But then when we get to number 5, 6, 7, and 8, that's when the fish was now no longer a larvae, but a free swimming adult and could go where it wanted. And you can see the rings have spread out as of 5. And so that's its first summer. By the time you get to number 6, it's its overwintering period. So it's not putting down these rings anymore because it's just resting in the sand. And then number 7 is its second summer where it's out feeding and putting all that pseudocalamus, those zooplankton in its mouth, probably a little bit of microplastics too to fill up, I guess. And then number 8 is another winter. And then there's just a little bit of black, and that's where then this fish got caught. And so what these researchers did is they went to several places throughout the English Channel, and they figured out what is the microchemistry signature of that area. So like, what does the nitrogen and the phosphorus look like here versus look like, you know, in Lancio Bay versus Rothenoof Bay. And then if you took samples from the otolith, at each of these different stages that we've identified, so I just put a green circle where the first sample was taken and then yellow circles for each of the subsequent ones. What the researchers found was that those trace elements for the larval stage have a signature of one place, and I just threw in Lancio Bay. But then as they become free-swimming adults, you find that they have a microchemistry signature of a different place. And what they found across all the adults is they all had they never moved once they were an adult. They always stayed in the same place. And some of these are only like 10 kilometers away from each other. So in summary, we know that sand lance can travel when they're larvae. At that time, they're sort of at the whim of the tides and the weather and currents. But then once they're adults, they're going to stick to their preferred burrowing habitat and go to that same sand patch every night and every winter. So yeah, they're very tied to one place, high site fidelity. Okay, that was like a long explanation, but I thought it was really cool. So my last point about this species that I think are interesting and eclectic is that they're very cryptic. They're very hard to study. So I did a search a while ago on the Web of Science. It's like 2 years old now. And I put in Ammodytes personatus. And what you find is there's only 17 published papers for our area, which if you were to look up, say, you know, coho or Chinook salmon, I think you probably have like 17,000 papers. So there's a lot yet that we are still learning and many research gaps to be filled in. Okay, so that's sort of high level biology. Let's move on. So Pacific sand lance are also major ecosystem contributors. Locally in the Pacific, they have over 100 known predators, and some of these predators are pretty important to our economies and our cultures. Several of their predators are listed as species at risk under SARA, our federal legislation, such as like marbled murrelets or the stellar sea lion. They also play a really important role in the the southern resident orca whale food chain. In some parts of the coast, especially during the summer when the sand lance are more active, Chinook have been found to eat quite a few sand lance. This Chinook, for example, was caught off the coast of Rose Spit in Haida Gwaii. Really great place if you ever get the chance to go. Very sandy, great sand lance habitat. And this Chinook had eaten 300 sand lance, and they were all in its stomach at the time that it was caught. This photo came from Will Duguid, who is running this really cool project called the Recreational Anglers Adult Salmon Diet Program. It's still going on. If any of you fish for salmon, you should really look it up and try to take part. It's super cool. Whenever you catch a salmon, you have to record the species, date, location, and some other things on a survey form. And then when you're gutting the salmon, they keep the stomachs, and then you put it either in one of those like drop-off bins. Sometimes they have them at popular fishing marinas, or some of the fish stores, like fish bait stores and lure stores and stuff like that, will have a freezer that are participating in the program, and some of the resorts are participating. And then all these stomachs get brought down to the lab. So this is Francis Wanis's lab at U of Vic. And a crew of students are going to open up that stomach and find out what that fish was eating, which is kind of cool. So then you get this very cool plot here, and I'm going to walk you through it. There's a lot going on, but it's a summary of all the fish that were caught in Chinook stomachs from 2017 to 2021. So on the y-axis here, we have mass, or the weight of in percent of the stomach contents. And then over on the other side is year. And so you can see we've got 2017 all the way up to 2021. And then in this box on the other side, it includes all the fish that we're looking at. So anchovy, sand lance, which are blue, herring, you're going to see a lot of them, gaddet, surf perch, lanternfish, and some others. And then at the top, we have different regions. So they were keeping the Chinook different based on region, and you do find that there's different diets based on the region. And then on the bottom, they've got it separated based on winter or summer, because there's lots of things that are available at different times of the year. Okay, so for the actual boxes, on the left is the summer and the right is the winter, and then the number in the center, so 157 and 41, they represent the number of Chinook that were caught. So here in the summer of 2018, in the Strait of Georgia, in the Southern Gulf Islands, Harrow Strait, Juan de Fuca, there was 157 Chinook caught in the summer and 41 in the winter. And mostly they were eating herring, which is the light green, and somewhat, they were about half in that summer, they were eating sand lance. So herring, pretty popular menu item, but sand lance, pretty prevalent as well. So then when we look at this whole plot, now that I've walked through it a bit, you can see herring are kind of the most prominent, and in different regions, you get different sort of contributors. So in the southern Strait of Georgia, that light blue is anchovy. In the Southern Gulf Islands, you see a lot of sand lance. Unfortunately, in 2021, we don't have a lot of data for Chinook because of some closures, which ultimately were probably a good thing, but too bad with this program. And this is, it's only a 5-year spread of data, but the takeaway, as far as we know, is that sand lance appear to make up about 1/3 of resident Chinook diets in some regions. Thus, the Southern Orca resident whale, who eats primarily Chinook salmon, hundreds of thousands of them every year, who each eat sand lance, they're an important species. And in summary, we can say that sand lance play an important and significant role in our coastal ecosystems. This photo, just so you know, it's pretty cool, but I added the sand lance after the Chinook. Okay, so sand lance, also back to sand lance and how interesting they are with their habitat needs. So they require very specific habitat. Because they lack a swim bladder, that's part of why they're burrowing into these coarse silt-free, they bury into coarse silt-free sandy sediments. And adults will bury into both the intertidal zone and the subtidal zone, primarily the subtidal, but you also find them in the intertidal zone. There's some pretty cool submarine-based work in Washington in these huge sand wave fields off of San Juan Island, where there's mostly really big, really healthy adults in the deeper water, and then they find that the sort of juvenile sand lance are using the shallower intertidal zones. And so sand lance spend most of their lives in the sand, not in the water. And this is why they need that particular habitat, because they need to be able to have oxygen come across their gills while they're buried in the sand. So that's why it has to be coarse and silt-free. That's where it's going to have interstitial space to allow oxygen to flow and get to their gills. And if you think about these habitats, they're relatively stationary. Definitely it can happen where, you know, in the winter, there's a coarse beach with like cobble, and then in the summer, it's a nice sandy beach, and that can happen. But generally that patch of sand might move offshore a little bit in the winter and say be back on the beach in the summer, or vice versa. But for the most part, sand patches exist in a stationary way. And these habitats that are critical for sand lance for their burrowing and for their spawning, they tie sand lance to very specific geographical areas. And so this is great for sand lance in that we can use it as a management tool to protect certain areas. But on the other hand, it also makes them more vulnerable to habitat damage or loss. So where are Pacific sand lance? Given that we know that the habitat is important and how important the species are, it's obviously important to know where their habitat is. And this has been the focus of my work over the last year. And so my supervisor as well, Cliff Robinson, and his team at DFO. And so he did a lot of subtitle surveys, which I helped out with, and this is what they look like. You go out on a cool fishing boat, and we drop this big, heavy Van Veen grab down to the bottom. Luckily, the boat has hydraulics for lifting it back up, because once you load it up with sand, it's very heavy. And then you get it out onto the deck of the boat and open it up. And sometimes you're lucky, and we find some sand lance. And so this is the work that the map that they were able to produce. And this map shows you anywhere where it's red is highly likely to have suitable sand lance subtidal habitat. So sort of what you're seeing in the photo by John Kelsey here. And they were able to summarize that about 2.6% of the Strait of Georgia and Harrow Strait, so that's about 105 kilometers squared, has highly suitable habitat, so not a lot. So what about the intertidal zone? Here is Montague Harbor, really beautiful shell hash beach if you've ever been. This is on the north side, looking out towards Trincomalee Channel. You can see that there's some sea ducks in the background, probably a bufflehead. And this is really difficult work to do because sand lance are very cryptic and very hard to find, and hard to find those eggs. So we paired up with community scientists, and they made this work possible. So there are many groups that I worked with that are now formally known as the BC Forage Fish Monitoring Network. And essentially I was able to gather a list of known spawning locations by working with them. These folks go out to beaches and they collect about 4 liters of sand at a time. In the winter, of course, where it can be snowing or sideways rain, because that's when the spawning happens. And so they collect about 4 liters of sand, which you can kind of see is what is in the white tub in the bottom here of the photo. And then they take that sand and they sieve it down with the mesh sieves. And so they end up with about a liter or a half a liter to a liter of sand that's left over. Then they use this vortex, which is what you're seeing on the other photo, the blue bowl, and then it has more sieves below it. You pour your sand into there and let it go around in the whirlpool, and any eggs that are in the sand attached to grains of sand are going to get picked up by the vortex and come fall over, and they'll land in your bottom sieve. And so afterwards, you end up with about, you start with 4 liters, sorry, and then you end up with half a liter of sand. So it's still a lot of sand. So then they take that sand and they look at it underneath a dissecting microscope. So this is sort of what it looks like in the photo on the left with all the sand, which is very beautiful, but really hard to find any eggs. You can see the red little string right in the middle. That's a piece of microplastic. And this can take 2 to 6 hours per sample to go through all the sand, because you go through like a dime's worth at a time, so not a lot. And then if any eggs are found, here's what they kind of look like up close under the microscope. we keep them and send them off for verification. And ultimately, you can imagine this is a very labor-intensive, slow process. The groups that I work with, they work with the Strait of Georgia Data Center, and they all upload their results to the same data depository, and I was able to go and access them. And so what we found is that between 2000 and 2020, there was this monumental effort where over 1,000 surveys were recorded. They took place at over 180 unique beach locations. And of those, there were 94 beaches where at least one egg was found. This number is now over 100, but this only went up to 2020, and that was the data that I used for my modeling work. So on the map that I'm showing you, you can see anywhere where there is a triangle, it's a location where a citizen scientist had found sand lance eggs in the intertidal zone. So this is not the subtitle. Remember, we're just sticking to the beach. And then so I was able to use these observations to build a habitat suitability model. And so what exactly is that? Maybe some of you might ask. That's where you take observations. And so I had 94 observations of sand lance eggs, and you take environmental predictors. So these are things like things that describe the environment. In my case, I was using fetch. So that's how much distance can wind and waves build up before they hit a beach, or what is the aspect of the beach? Is it facing north? Is it facing south? How steep is the beach? Like, what is the slope angle of that beach? What is the sediment on that beach? Is it sand, rock, mud, clay, or mixed? And so I ultimately ended up with 6 environmental predictors, although I tested 9. And then you use a statistical formula. So I use maximum entropy, or maxent for short. It's a complicated machine learning algorithm that I put into a coding platform, into R, and I brought it all together, and I ran this many, many, many times. And then you end up with a map that gives you areas of suitability, of likelihood. So it doesn't say this is habitat and this isn't habitat. It gives you likelihood. So this is an area that is likely to have habitat. And this is not perfect, but when you're starting from somewhere where you don't have anything, or just a handful of observations for scattered areas that don't cover the entire area, this is a really good way to go. And it was just the right timing, because the citizen scientists had put in all these years of work. And so there was this data set ready to be used across, a large region. What we ended up with is these beautiful maps here. Unfortunately, I can't show you the entire strait all at once, because the intertidal zone is so thin. When I show you that large area, you wouldn't see anything. So I've just picked a few key areas for you to look at. So the first one you're seeing is Sydney and James Island. So this is just right off of Swartz Bay, where the ferry terminal comes in. And you can also see Island View Beach. It says Island View Beach, which is a really great beach if you've ever been. And then in the center, I've got Goose Spit, which is right where Comox and Courtney are. And then in the last image, I have Vancouver in English Bay. And what you can see is any area that is warmer or red, those represent areas of high likelihood where you're likely to see sand lance spawning habitat, that is. And anywhere where it's black, those actually showing you areas that you can't trust. So I've done some extra statistics and said, this is where the model isn't as good. I'm going to just black those areas out so we don't look at them. And then anywhere that's blue or colder is areas where it's less likely to have habitat. And so right in the center in Comox Harbor, it's very silty, not a lot of great oxygen flow in those sediments. It's not predicted to be good habitat, and that makes sense. So let's look a little closer at one of these. So here is Hernando Island and Savory Island. If you ever get the chance to go, Savory is just a beach lover's paradise. And as you can see, there's a lot of suitable habitat around it. And I just want you to also know that some of these maps that I'm showing you, I've picked areas that have a lot of suitable habitat. If we were to look at, say, Texada Island or sort of West Vancouver, there's not nearly as much red, and you're seeing a lot more blue. So in Vancouver, I find it really interesting. If you look down at the bottom, I don't think you guys can see my mouse, but if you look where the Fraser comes out of the north arm, right at UBC, it's all blue. And that's because it's really silty. There's lots of slower moving currents there on the edges where all the logs are and in the wetlands. It's great habitat for other things, but not for sandlands. And then as the Fraser comes out with all that sediment in it, and it comes around the corner, around Point Grey, you start to get those like really beautiful beaches. Of course, Wreck Beach is like the first one, and it's not that well highlighted on our map, but as soon as you go around the corner and you're hitting Spanish Banks and English Bay, Kitsilano Beach, and then the beaches of Stanley Park, and then you get these like beautiful, great areas of sand. And that's because the current comes out and goes around the corner and has this like longitudinal drift. And then Ambleside, it's just downstream of the Capilano, another great sand source. And then you also have the First Narrows where there's like all this current coming in and out. It's because it's a spot that's tight and there's all that tidal movement there. And so as the current comes through underneath the Lionsgate Bridge there, that sand comes out and around the corner on each side of Stanley Park and then onto Ambleside. And Ambleside, I even found some buried adults there one year. It's a really great beach. So yeah, it's exciting. We made a map. Makes sense for the most part. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. One thing that we found that it does struggle with is what we call pocket beaches. So beaches that are only a few meters big and might be suitable and might have sand lance on them, spawning in them, but our model just doesn't work at that small of a scale and can't pick it up. So although the model is very useful, it's more than just a map, and we can learn a lot from it. The first thing that we can do with it is estimate quantity of habitat. So we can break it down into habitat that is good, moderate, versus poor, or even not suitable at all, and figure out how much area of habitat there is. So to answer that, I'm going to show you, well, first I'm showing you the graphic that we built as kind of the cover of this paper. And so I'm going to explain a bit of the bones of the model, how it works in the back, so that you can understand how we come up with estimating the quality for each of these different categories. So if we were to zoom in where this red circle is, what you would see if you zoomed in like really close is all these little squares, these little cells, and each cell represents 20 meters by 20 meters of a specific area. And when I run the model, I end up getting a value for each of these cells. And here what I'm showing you is you've got an area of habitat that's bordered by the high tide line on the left, and then the subtidal zone is the other end, which I didn't go into. That's what a different model does. I've broken it all up into 20 by 20 meter boxes. And each cell is given a value based on that mathematical formula, the Maxent formula, done in an earlier step. And values of habitat suitability in the map range from 0 to 1. The closer to 1, the higher the suitability. So in my little graphic, the dark purple, higher suitability, higher numbers, like this top left square is 0.95, very suitable, looking great. And that's where we expect great, coarse, silt-free habitat to be. And then if it has a lower number, like 0.10, far less likely. So it could be like a silty area, something you would expect to find in bays. And so once you kind of understand that this is what your model is made up of, then you can count how much we have in each of these categories. And I created four categories, highly likely to highly unlikely, and each one includes a different range of values. Highly likely includes any of the cells that have a value of 0.87 or more, and highly unlikely includes cells with values of 0.43 or less, and then likely and unlikely are, ranges in between there. And I didn't just make these up; they came from a different statistical test that I did. So if you look at the intertidal zone in the Canadian side of the Salish Sea, there's about 522 kilometers squared of habitat. And then if I take my model and I say, in my GIS program, okay, how much area is in each one of these categories? This is what you get. So highly unlikely has 329 kilometers squared, unlikely has 57 kilometers squared, likely 21 kilometers squared, and highly likely the least amount with 7 kilometers squared. So it's not a lot. Most of the study area, 63% of it, that is made up of a highly unlikely habitat. If we put those last two categories together, we get 5% or 28 kilometers squared of the intertidal zone of the Canadian Salish Sea is likely or highly likely to have suitable habitat, spawning habitat for Pacific sandlands. And so you can summarize that there's not a lot of suitable spawning places for this species. Their habitat is rare and uncommon. So what else can we use this model for? Well, we can also use it to help us identify potential habitat that we don't know about. So if you look at our maps, we can look at the places we haven't yet visited, and we can use it to tell us where we expect habitat, but we can also use it as a first line of practice when a project or a proponent is looking to develop an area and say, okay, what are all the things we need them to consider before they build a marina, build a port, someone wants to put in a seawall, something like that. So it's a really useful tool for regulators like those at DFO in the province, or a biologist who's helping an industry partner have the least amount of impact as possible. And one thing I'm excited about is that DFO is using this model, and it's going to probably help them a lot with the first step at, a permit application came in. Oh, looks like there is sandlands habitat here, or, oh, it doesn't look like there is. Okay, we don't have to be as concerned about it. But if there is, then they can ask the proponent to do more surveys. Another thing we can use the model for is to help us better understand what drives the relationships for this species. What are the most important habitat features that lead to the presence of this habitat? So one thing that we learned is that estuaries are actually the top predictor of where you find suitable sandlands intertidal habitat. And so this highlights the importance of ecosystem interconnectivity, particularly with estuaries. So it's important that we minimize and avoid interrupting the flow of sand and sediments from rivers into the ocean and along shores. Thus, we should be careful and think carefully when we're installing dikes and seawalls and groins wherever possible. And I thought this picture of the Fraser River coming out, I'm sure many of you have seen it before. It's just such strong imagery for like, oh yeah, look at all that sediment coming out of the Fraser and how it like moves out, and the tides just move it around all day long, dropping that great sand all over these fabulous beaches that we like to hang out on, but are also important habitat. So finally, another thing that we can use the habitat model for is a tool to build bigger models. So now that we know what are the important parts that go into building a model here in the Salish Sea, those relationships are likely to hold true elsewhere, and we can use it as a first starting point for other places. Through the efforts of all these community scientists, we made a model here, and that's about 15% of the coast. But BC has 25,000 kilometers of coastline, and managers are going to need to know where habitat is if they're going to be able to account for and conserve this species in the long term. So we're planning to use what we've learned here to first start on the outer coast of Vancouver Island, hopefully in the next year if some of our funding comes through, fingers crossed for me, to do more modeling. But then my bigger dream would be to take this model up the entire coast. And so ultimately, it's not just a map, but it's a useful management tool that can lead to informed decision making. Okay. So, oops. Oh yeah, sorry. Joan, do you want to give me a time check? Like, I actually have a second part. If we want to dive deeper, I can just leave it here.
We've got about, it's about 20 after 8 right now. So you could carry on for another 10, 15 minutes if you like.
Okay, yeah, I can talk briefly about some of the threats. So, so this habitat does appear to be threatened. Anecdotally, what we're finding is that coarse, sandy, silt-free habitats that are required by salients for spawning and burrowing, we appear to be losing them. So here I'm showing you two photos from the 20s. The top one is of Patricia Bay Beach on Vancouver Island. It's on the inlet side. And down below is Stanley Park. And you can see there's all these great patches of sand and turbid water around the edges of Stanley Park. And then if you look at these photos in the 2000s, of these places in the 2000s, you see that Patricia Bay Beach is much coarser and it's losing a lot of that nice sand. And the same thing for Stanley Park, is it's losing its beaches. So, and this is on account of shoreline hardening. So in both of these places, hard armoring has occurred in the background. If you look at the photo of Patricia Bay Beach in 2005, you can kind of see at the top, there's a flat spot. That's where there's a road. And in Stanley Park, many of you probably know, of course, that there's the seawall. So these are hard structures that, that are along the edges of the beach, and they lead to erosion of sand and sediment. And so there's also coastal squeeze and changes the shoreline currents with climate change. But in these two cases, we think it's primarily due to armoring. And when it comes to shoreline hardening, is that it interrupts the movement of sand either from the terrestrial side or along shore. And it decreases the beach's width. And once that hard structure is installed, it can't replenish itself. So here's the Stanley Park seawall. Was this year? This was 2 years ago, I think, actually, when a big storm came through and took out part of the seawall. And then what happens is waves, which have energy, wash ashore. And usually they dissipate gradually along the beach slope. But now that there are hard structures in place, that wave with all that energy, it still has to go somewhere. So instead of dissipating gradually along the shoreline, it goes up and down. So when it goes up, it just makes a big spray, which sometimes can damage buildings or trees or whatever's up there. But when that energy goes down, and usually some of it does, it grabs with it anything that's there, like sand, and moves it offshore a little bit, leaving only the bigger, heavier, coarser material that isn't useful to shore spawners. And so, yeah, in this figure, I sort of had number one, where all that sediment is getting picked up, and then it gets moved out offshore to number two. So, oh yeah, and then over time, what happens actually is that hardened structure that's there actually gets undermined, and then it can make the problem worse because now it's dug a big hole deeper and it's made that shoreline a lot steeper. So then when that wall falls over, you've got this really steep shoreline, and then the water is able to come in and grab all that material, and then the erosion just gets worse and worse. Okay, so that's how we ended up here at coarser beaches. And what about other threats? Well, we're beginning to gather and see that there are a lot of threats to sandlands. For example, recreational beach use, particularly anywhere people are driving on beaches or riding their horses on beaches, or dogs seem to be a bit of a problem for sandlands. There's also non-point source pollutants as well as point source pollutants. Elevated CO2 is leading to early arrest or death of eggs. Like there's 95% death to eggs when there's a certain level of CO2 reached, which is what is predicted to that we will get to in 200 years. Sea level rise is squeezing that coastal area and those beaches, bringing the sea closer to homes, more likely, like making it more likely that people are going to want to install shoreline hardening protection measures, accidental spills. So there's all these threats floating around. And that's part of my next chapter, which is going to be, or is, I'm mostly done actually, a vulnerability and risk assessment of Pacific sandlands in the Salish Sea. And this is where I've worked with about 40 experts to help identify what are all the threats, prioritize them, and help us better understand what they are. Are there any actions that can be taken? What are those actions? And then I'm also at the same time asking them about their knowledge on the population status, because something else we've never been able to do for this species is go out and figure out how many there are. So we're just kind of starting with is the population increasing, decreasing? Is it stable? Is it crashing? By how much? What do you think it's going to look like in the future? And it's pretty interesting stuff, but I'm going to leave it at this, and it's a whole presentation on its own. So that is all. These are the logos of all of the conservation groups that I've worked with, and really grateful to have worked with them and their data, and continue to work with them as part of the BC Forage Risk Monitoring Network. Thank you all for coming in and paying attention. Feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions if we don't answer them today.